right, let's talk about data. First of all, a little mini agenda about what we'll go over. First, I'll tell you a little bit about me, and then we'll talk about data consistency. There's sort of 3 topic areas we're going to walk through, and don't worry, we'll pause for questions in between so we can talk about some of the things that come up. And then at the end, we'll just have like a brief recap. So with that, this is the 3 big topics that we'll cover within data consistency. So we're going to talk about primary sources, going beyond your data, and then what to do with all of it. And now I'm just going to tell you a little bit about me. So my name is Milena, and I am a senior product manager at Crowdcube. And I've been at Crowdcube about 3 years now, but I've been in product for about 7 years. So actually, when I came out of university, I studied urban planning and then mathematics, and it was like applied mathematics and optimization. And I would tell people urban planning is like for people who never grew out of SimCity, they just wanted to do it their whole life. But I found the pace a little bit too slow for my liking. What I did is I worked in transportation planning and in an area called transportation modeling. So, you can see these like really cool maps with Transcad. Like, I didn't build anything like this. I didn't even build anything that looks remotely like this. I was a few cubicles over, like cleaning data for the people who were like building these kinds of models. But it was a great place to actually learn and understand data structures, databases in general. Just at a very high level, like what data cleaning means, in order to be able to analyze it and interrogate it. So that was kind of where I started with data and being familiar with it. After that, I joined General Motors, and actually I joined a very small company that worked for General Motors. And so this is like Cadillac, Chevrolet in North America, and Opel, Vauxhall in Europe. And the company that I worked for actually manages the global CMS for GM. So I don't know if any of you are familiar. CMS is a content management system. So it pulls in data and then pushes it, either to automatic reporting or websites or things like that. So again, very, very data-centric company, very much had to understand data pipelines and what you were trying to feed into. And that was a really great place to learn as well. This is where I truly got into product. This is where I, really started to appreciate for understanding the need behind what people ask you for. So this is a type of role where, someone might come and say, we need a button to export this report. You'd be like, okay, can you tell me about that? And they'd be like, well, I export it and then I email it to, so-and-so from some other department. You'd be like, okay, well, we could build you a button, we could do that, but we could also just automatically send it to them on, some trigger that we talk about and agree on. So it's kind of like a simple example, but this is like the place where we really started to think that way in terms of what's your product actually solving, what's it trying to do for its end users. After working with developers, I was actually quite eager to understand tech myself a little bit better. So I did a software development boot camp, and I did Makers Academy here in London. This is me sleeping or something in the back. I don't know, I have my eyes closed for it, but that was just an amazing experience. This is like the cohort I was with. And it really gave me the solid foundation to be able to ask developers any questions about things that I don't really know about. So it just kind of gave me that technical confidence. I'm not going to say I know everything going on in the stack, but yeah, I feel quite comfortable in developers. Yeah.
You were doing that whilst you were working at the same time?
I left my role, because this is like a full-time, immersive. Yeah, I don't know how anybody would do it with a full-time job because it was more than a full-time job, but I can't recommend it enough. They're not paying me to say that, but really it was just an incredible experience and I learned a ton. So yeah, happy to chat about that as well. And then after Makers Academy, I joined Crowdcube, and this is us and our team. I just really want to point out there's more women on our team. This was us doing a race, and I happened to be the only woman here doing this race. But yeah, there's more women at Crowdcube, so just wanted to put that up there. So yeah, this is maybe more of a mix of like what our team looks like. And Crowdcube, for anybody who doesn't know, is an equity-based crowdfunding platform. So anyone who's heard of Indiegogo or Kickstarter, that's a crowdfunding platform where people pledge, and then maybe depending on the amount you've pledged, you might get like an early prototype, you get some type of reward. Crowdcube, instead of getting a reward, although we do have some of those, you get equity in the company in the form of stock or bonds. So that's where I am at now, and it is really exciting. So to get into the actual data talk, well, before I start this, just any questions? I mean, it's just the intro, so there wasn't a whole lot there, but.
Are you based here in London, or are you traveling?
Yeah, so our company has offices in London, and also we're based in Exeter, so it's in Devon in the southwest, and I'm just in London for a little bit, just, yeah, between offices. But yeah, we do have an office in London, and at the end I'll tell you about how we're hiring, but that's another story. Like I said earlier, this talk is going to go across 3 topics. And the first one's called primary sources. And then the third one's the most about data consistency. These things are just kind of leading up into that. So yeah, if you'll allow me, we're just going to talk about how understanding your data model is understanding your product. So how many of you have heard of the term MVC or MVC architecture? Yep. So MVC stands for Model View Controller, and it's a design of a web application. So here, when I'm talking about understanding your data model, I don't mean that in like this technical architecture, deep tech way of knowing what the data model is. But what I am talking about is just about every product has data entities. And to use like one of the most common ones, like any app that you have has a concept of a user. A user is like a data entity. And when I say understanding your product's data model is understanding your product, it's understanding like the parameters that go for those entities and which ones are required and which ones are not, and understanding the relationships between those entities is pretty much you understanding what your product can do, what its limitations are, and what its opportunities are. So sometimes data architects, and again, we're not going to go deep or very technical into this, but sometimes people who are in like designing databases or the table structure, they'll write out something like these kinds of diagrams here where like a student has an ID, a name, an email, and a major. Hopefully this makes sense. And they might draw diagrams by how their data entities are connected. And I want to focus on this for a little bit because I think particularly if you're new to a product, maybe not just one that you're using, but also one where you're working at, the quicker you understand these relationships, the more familiar you'll be with like what's going on under the hood. And this is extremely helpful to have those like deep conversations with your development team, so when you ask them, can we quickly pull up which instructor a student has, quickly understand whether those things are related in your application. So some of the things that are mapped out here are, something that I would call like primary data parameters. So, for example, if you sign up with like Facebook, for example, you might be required to give them a phone number, an email, and then for some other like parameters, they might be totally optional because they're not really related to how you're going to use the product. And we'll come back to some of those things in a little bit, but just when we talk about primary data, that's what we mean. So this is an example of the profile in the Crowdcube app. And this isn't like, ground shattering, I guess. Like you probably imagine that we're asking people for their address details, how to contact them, phone number, we ask for their sex, and then a few other things related to investing. Now, I want to pause here and talk about how we ask for sex. So when I first joined Crowdcube, we were asking for sex. It was required everywhere. It still is. But we were calling it gender, and we only had, as you can guess, male and female. And anyone who has maybe talked about this or thought about this in other roles or diversity inclusion, like there's nothing about investing that needs to know about your organs in order to make an investment. So one of the things we did is we're like, we're trying to get a sense of how people identify. And even that's more for us to understand who investors are, and it has nothing to do with you being able to make an investment. But I bring this up because the seemingly innocent attribute about someone, this is where you should pause and think about what is it doing in your product, why is it there, and how are you using it? So fortunately, we've changed it since. We ask people, if they're a man or a woman or how they identify, and we also give them a chance to opt out. We also give them a chance to say, not one of these categories and something. So we just, in my opinion, we've made it much more inclusive. We're not putting people into boxes. But again, coming back to think about what's your data model, why are certain things required, just something to consider. Yeah?
Why even ask for it?
So we actually just want to understand who our user base is, and actually we want to do it for both people trying to raise finance as well as people who are investing.
So is it sort of retargeting certain segments?
Yep, yeah. I mean, retargeting either direct marketing. I don't think we do anything specific that's let's email all the women, but we do want to break down what people's behaviors are, and yeah, are there any patterns maybe across different sectors? Are there different implications for risk or the type of investments people invest in? So it's just trying to understand what are people's motivations for using our product. So the next bit I want to go over is thinking about going beyond your data. I imagine most of us here who are on Medium or have been to probably other product school talks, you probably have people saying, how are you going to go about making data-led decisions? You want to be a data-led company. And I don't disagree at all. I would say it's probably more important to be data-informed and to understand the limitations in your data in order to be data-led. And maybe that's just a matter of semantics, but for reasons I'll walk you through shortly, just bear that in mind. Think beyond your data sometimes. Your data is a tool, and it's one of many in your toolkit. So, like I mentioned, I'm working at Crowdcube, and one of the areas that I focus on is how to onboard companies who want to raise finance, how they bring their pitch together, build their campaign in order to go live. And so, as you could expect, our team have a pipeline of companies, going through, and they're all at various stages of this onboarding process because, first of all, we're a financially regulated product. So there's compliance checks, there's legal reviews. I mean, it's not quite like a Kickstarter with anyone with an idea could just, post it up. There's a little bit more due diligence in, assessing people's eligibility to raise finance. So we have this onboarding process, and there's, at any given time, thousands of companies in it. And as you could probably imagine, they're all kind of in various states of progress. I mean, there's some people who've started and are almost completed. Some people are flying through it. Other people do it in spurts. And obviously, I mean, as a PM and people in operations on our team, they want to understand why. They want to understand, are you stuck? Do you need help? Is something unclear? And we're just always talking about what's going on in our pipeline. Why are people where they are? And we do this. We have reporting. We definitely have automated reports that tell us this number of deals this week, and this many people are here, and this many people just submitted to be reviewed, and so on and so forth. But we were looking at it, and from talking to our internal campaigns team who does some of this review, they told us that a lot of times they're having the same conversations over and over again, which is educating people about what to expect and how to build their pitches. And we're okay, well, this is good to know. Maybe our product is doing a poor job of educating people. So being the scrappy team that we are, we're well, we'll just give them some text. We'll explain everything they need to know right in the product. We'll add, you can't see it here, but helpful links and tooltips and things like that where they could quickly refer to something. And we'll do this maybe for every question or kind of the important areas where people might get stuck. And I mean, you could probably see this from a mile away, but what do you think happened?
People didn't read.
Yeah. Not a whole lot. This was us for a good long while. You know, and I think like it's kind of funny, but it didn't really do anything, and I think we were hoping it would, but it didn't change anything about our pipeline data. And we'll come back to why in a bit, but yeah, effectively people just didn't read it. So again, working with our campaigns team, with our operations team, we were like, well, how do we do this so that we make this process easier for people? And we were hung up on the things that, you know, actually building your pitch is really easy. Like all of you could probably create an account tomorrow and quickly add pictures and text, you know, and build a pitch page. But the stuff that's actually hard is building like a crowdfunding campaign, you know, having like a social media campaign that lines up with when you're going to go live, and like talking to your network, you know, and doing all the things that will like make your campaign successful. Like that's hard. And some of the steps in this process are part of the hard part. Some of these steps are easy. And we just wanted to make it easier for people to know, like, hey, you should focus on this because, you know, adding your Twitter handle will take 10 seconds. So that's not really that important. Yeah.
There's a lot of the responses to places that were stuck in the process, where you were internally sort of going, well, if we did this, do you think that would move it along? Or are you actually speaking to your physical users?
We did, and that's, yeah, so that's what I was about to say. We brought them together. We usually did it in line with trying to tie it into like an event, which we did, which was like people who are in there working on their pitches. We invited them in so we can talk to them and help them through anything with like a person in the room, and the product people, you know, trying to like figure out what's going on. And additionally here, like with this example, we built a prototype because what we wanted to do is we wanted to highlight the difficult steps, and we wanted to give people like prompts about taking care of the hard stuff first, thinking, well, maybe if they knew how long things took them, you know, like average 2 minutes, average 15 minutes, like, you know, maybe they get a sense of like where the effort's gonna be in like putting their pitches together. So we did this. This is a prototype. The prototype also had little like video things and pop-ups, and it was very interactive. So we took this in front of users, and it had some interesting discussions. Like people, you know, definitely gave us feedback on the layout. But what also happened is something like, and by the way, these proportions kind of overlap, so don't focus on the numbers. Something like half the people told us like they just don't read any text. Like they see it like a big green button and they just go for it. They don't pause. Maybe like a third of the people said, hey, I'd really like this in a video. You know, I don't want to read. I would watch a video. And then maybe something like another third, and again, these aren't exact proportions, but maybe like another third said, I might watch the video, but that kind of depends on like how long it is and maybe what that picture is, you know, for like whether I know I should play it or not. And we weren't even testing that. Like we weren't even like looking at what content are we using. It was just, can we get them to go through this process? So that is precisely what I mean by like, think beyond your data. Like your data will tell you like what, but you know, think beyond that in terms of what's going on in your product. Separately, so we saw that some people who were mostly finished with this process, you know, and still weren't submitting on to the next stage, you know, and they were just sitting in the pipeline, we decided we'd invite them in and we talked to them. We figured maybe if they're stuck, they could work with someone from our team while the product people are there, and we could try to understand their pain points a little bit better. And so we brought them in, we talked to them, and we had our product up, obviously, we're going through it. And again, like, this is a slightly different set of people than we first talked to. Half the people told us, like, yeah, I don't really read stuff. And then again, something like a quarter to a third were like, can you just give me this in a video? Because I'd rather watch a video than read this content. And then maybe again, like some other small proportion said, yeah, I might watch a video. You know, I click around and see what other stuff is there. But yeah, sometimes I read it. You know, it just depends on where I'm at or what I'm doing. And that was really interesting because neither of these sessions, neither of these exercises, you know, we're looking at the content, but bringing those people in and talking to them, like, gave us much more insight about where they were in our pipeline and why they were there than what we were looking at in our reports, which is like, they're stuck or this is too difficult, because that didn't really seem to be the case here. Yeah.
So you brought them in and had an interview with them as opposed to giving them a call?
Yeah, so we did, what we had is like we called it like I think it was like a go live workshop. So we had members of our legal team, and we had members, and I say that because they like do legal reviews, not for any other reason. We have members of our campaigns team. So we just wanted to bring them in and say, we'll work with you, we're here, it's like an open house all day. Stop in when you can, and we'll just talk to you and help you with whatever you may be stuck with in this whole process.
And
so yeah.
The incentive was just for them to actually get a campaign live?
Yeah, and they, since most of the time they're working in the product, they're not so much, depending on what stage you're at, they don't have somebody they're going to call every day. So like they appreciate coming in and just having all their questions answered. Interestingly enough, and this is a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's still worth noting, some of the things that we look at in our pipeline is how long does it take people to build and launch their pitches, and how long does it take us to do the legal review and do the compliance reviews, and all the due diligence that we do on these pitches. And what's interesting is like when we talk to people, people who have been in there for like maybe months or a while, and they would tell us things like, but we know our product is launching like 6 months from now, so we're not really in a rush. Like we just wanted to start working on this, but actually we'll come back and we'll launch when we're closer to like releasing this thing that we're working on. Or people would say, but we're talking to investors or some company that wants to invest, and we're still working with them, so when they're ready to invest, then we'll like launch our product. So it's kind of like within our company, we were measuring ourselves and our process and our pipeline, based on these expectations that if people aren't moving through, they're stuck. And actually, when we brought them in and talked to them, like some of them were just, doing it on their own time. So yeah, that's pretty illuminating. And my point here being is like, there's nothing wrong with metrics, and there's nothing wrong with like getting a sense of like what's going on in your product, but it's also, it can be a little bit of an incomplete picture without context or without really understanding your customers and what their motivations are. And I mean, I'm sure that's a little obvious, like it's obvious in our company too, it's really hard to break away in practice. Yeah, absolutely.
My question was, how easy was it to get people to come in? I know you I know, like you said, there was an incentive for how easy was it to get people to come in?
So that's a good question, because we know that these entrepreneurs are really busy people, like they're running a company, but actually it really wasn't so bad with enough notice. So we had actually a couple of these sessions, like 2 to 3, and I mean, as you could imagine, like the shorter notice that you gave people, the more it was, harder for a lot of people to show up. The other thing is I mean, we have customers, all over the UK, but specifically we had our sessions in London because, we have a higher concentration of companies here. So it's actually a pretty good turnout. And I think somebody asked, did we do these sessions on the phone? We didn't. And particularly part of that is just the nature of the sessions and the amount of people we wanted to be involved. But I would absolutely do it on the phone as well, depending on what I want to talk to customers about. Yeah.
Do you ever consider actually selling this information, then that they will actually read, they pay for it?
The answer is yes, because we share these ideas all the time. But I think, personally for the company, like in our mission, it's to help these companies like eligibly have pitches and raise finance. So I think we're not really there, as that's not really our strategy at the moment. But we've absolutely talked about it.
Did you find, obviously the main motive of your workshop was to understand the pain points and go deeper, but did you find it actually, like after you've had the workshops, after the education piece and that human connection, that there was basically like higher completion rates? Like, did you find that multi-channel approach of like digital first and that kind of human approach helped people
go through it? The answer is no. it wasn't really conclusive. Like they were just, the results were different enough, and it just really depended on where that entrepreneur was in terms of being ready to launch. But yeah, I think for them, you know, depending on the maturity of their company and like whether they've experienced crowdfunding before, some of them really appreciated having someone to talk to and like ask questions to. But to be perfectly honest, some of the companies who've raised finance before, they're in here and they're like, I know what I'm doing. I just want to get it done. You know, and they're maybe working to a completely different timeline or different set of expectations. So I did think we find that the people who were there were the people who were less experienced. And that says a lot as well, right? Like maybe our product isn't like supportive enough yet or mature enough to be that all-encompassing experience for someone who is just absolutely brand new to crowdfunding and they do have a lot to learn. Yeah, yes.
Sorry, slight follow-up.
Yeah.
How do you value and map the qualitative data, such as interviews, against quantitative data? So how long a user took to complete a certain stage?
Yeah.
What value?
So yeah, so I mean, here's what happens with the qualitative data. You know, like I said, like in our company, we have internal dashboards and reports that look at things like time to build your pitch and time to go live and time to be reviewed and all that and so on and so forth. But when we have the qualitative data, it's actually more like of a talking point and more of an education point within the company that we need to change our language and our expectations around our product, and we need to change our success criteria because it doesn't match up with what our customers are doing. So it's kind of like we're going to be working in a two-tiered system if we're trying to optimize for something that just doesn't make sense to our customers.
But say if you have 10 people who interview
Yeah.
saying my pain point is at this stage in the process,
Yeah.
how do you weight that against 200 people who didn't make it past that stage of the process?
Yeah.
Do you, yeah.
I mean, we would probably still use product data and use the qualitative assessments to sort of back up the fact that, you know, actually we see people are stuck here and we've talked to our customers. And, you know, even though talking to them may not necessarily be like automated, I think in some ways we're all human and it kind of ends up carrying more weight, wrongly or rightly, because sometimes, you know, that could also be like a recency bias type thing. But if your data says that and your customers are saying it as well, I mean, I think that's pretty stark evidence there that maybe there's an issue.
Yeah.
And there's a question. Did you have a question? No?
It was just a thought that came.
Yeah.
But based on the results you got from the humans, did you change things going forward in terms of interacting with them, or did you just keep it that way to find out where they were in their stages?
Yeah, actually what we did change was actually thinking about, and I'll come back to this in the next part, is actually thinking about how we're measuring the experience in the pipeline, because we wanted the way we measure it to match up with how people are using the product. Additionally, like I said, it kind of changed the conversations we were having within the company. And to me, it was really exciting because, you know, some of the teams that were part of this exercise, like you would hear them talking to people in our company, like they kind of just became the voice of the user. Like when someone's trying to prioritize maybe like time to get a pitch live, you know, we'd have people saying, but it really doesn't matter, you know? So it's kind of, is it a vanity for metric for us? I don't know. Yeah.
Did you sort of do some analysis on understanding sort of the size of the money that was being asked for, or the sector that it was asked for? Because
Yeah.
to me, that's going to have a lot of variety, how quickly people will go through the process
Yeah.
or not. You know,
Yeah.
£10 or 10 million, there's probably a lot more at stake.
Yeah, and a lot more variables as well too when that change. The answer is, and this gets into, yeah, I mean this gets into exactly what we're talking about really, but the answer is yes and no. But actually the quality of the data set there, it shrinks so much within some of those sectors that is just inconclusive for anything like we can say with confidence or statistical significance. And particularly when you take that and you try to extrapolate it to pitches who launch and then fund, you know, and are successful all the way through. So just your data set continues to shrink along the pipeline. And yeah, not yet. We haven't had any like really successful measures.
Anecdotally, where it's not statistically
Yep.
going to be robust,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
just
Anecdotally,
internally.
absolutely, and this is the bit where we know companies, if they're raising like a slightly bigger amount of money, this probably isn't their first rodeo, they know exactly what they need to do to go through, and those companies, definitely need less support. They definitely come with their own attributes and their own, very unique experience, unlike people who are just brand new to it. These are really good questions, by the way. Are you all product people already? Yeah, that's awesome. And so my point here in thinking beyond the data, and hopefully this doesn't come as a surprise to you, is that your data is a tool. It's definitely telling you what's happening in your product, but talking to your customers is really building out that context about why that's happening. And hopefully, and this has been a challenge, and it's like an ongoing conversation within our company, but hopefully you could use that to change the conversation around your success metrics and the things you're trying to optimize for. So we're collecting data, we have data, we're measuring our funnel, and now you're probably, I ask myself, what are we gonna do with all this data? And fortunately, there's plenty of answers for that, but I just want to touch on some things not to do or consider not doing. So I mentioned a little bit about vanity metrics, and I'm not going to go through it because I think you're familiar with vanity metrics, right? Yeah, okay. So basically the things that, may look good, but really deep down, they don't really matter. They aren't going to drive revenue or long-term engagement in your product. So I guess from going through some of the stories I've told you now and about our pain points, the way I would approach anytime you gather data about your customers and your product is don't collect anything you don't need, and this may be slightly different to what we were talking about beginning with the primary requirements for your data entities. But if you think about some of the secondary attributes like tracking and behavior and what people are doing, pause and consider how you're going to use that in the future, because I'll offer you a couple of cautionary tales. So we have in our product, sorry, I'll come back to this, but hopefully you all understand the Simon Sinek comment, start with the why. This very much transcends into your data and knowing what you're measuring and really starting with the why. But coming back to my example, this is our pitch page. And this probably looks similar to Kickstarter, Indiegogo, where people tell us about their company, tell us about their idea, how they plan to grow it. And then you'll notice here there's a video. So we have, for this video and all videos on our site and product, we have tracking. And I imagine your product, you guys have tracking too. It probably precedes you. And we have tracking in place, and it checks who's watching the video, or not who, but it's checking people who start watching the video, where they stop, how far in they got, do they see it all the way through, do they not, so on and so forth. And we've had this tracking for ages, definitely before me. But somewhere along the way when we were talking about the whole pitch page and redesigning it, moving things around, one of the PMs at our company asked, cool, let's look at the data for our video, and see, did people who watched the video go on to invest? We're yeah. So go and dig in our data. And it turns out we have tracking, but we have no obvious way of getting that information. So somewhere we have, a data warehouse full of this data around our video and people who've seen it. And we could easily look that up. We could see how many people visited the site, visited the pitch page, did they click on it, did they finish it? But it wasn't really answering the type of things we were trying to answer. And by the way, we've since relooked at that and approached it in a slightly different way. And actually, we're now gathering data for that to answer those questions. But this is a really common thing to get into. And has anyone seen this at their company by any chance? Yeah, okay. So be glad, please. I hope you don't have to run into this problem. And the reason I say this is because I imagine within your teams and the people you work with, we work with smart operations people and smart campaigns people, and they know, we have data and we have tracking, and they raise really good questions. But because some of this tracking wasn't set up to answer product problems, it's really hard to extract value out of it, in a retrospective basis. So with that, I do want to say maybe sometimes you're thinking like, we'll collect it just in case. And I mean, I'm not going to tell you whether there's something right or wrong with that. Like, you can work that out for the examples that you might be facing. But I will say, personally, from my experience, anytime we dug into data that was there just in case, it was poorly structured or really difficult to structure in the way that you would need it to be in order to learn something out of it. I mean, so much so that it was kind of like, we could either rebuild this or we could either spend the time trying to clean this and analyze this. And I've done that before, so I was like, no, we're going to start from scratch. Yeah, I had another example too, but I think the pitch video one is slightly a little bit more exciting. So fortunately, we have a data scientist on our team. We could bring him on fairly early. He too has been with the company after we've implemented tracking and data and stuff, so he wasn't there at the very beginning to inform what we're looking for. But one of the things he mentioned is, the thing is when you're working with data and you're trying to answer questions with it, like the most important factor is having patience to gather the right data, and not just the right amount, but having patience to go back and iterate on maybe some of the data you think you're getting and is useful, but then you might have to go back and maybe slightly rebuild your tracking or slightly rebuild how you're going to collect that from your customers and your product. And I thought this was really important because depending on your organization and depending on your role or your team and their focus, I personally work at a growth stage company, so things move pretty quickly. We might pivot, we might, GDPR might drop out of the sky and you all suddenly have to focus on that. So you don't always have the luxury to sit there and focus and see something all the way through. But I do think this is still really important, and it's still really important if you're saying, okay, we have tracking, let's use it and answer our questions. Just expect that it's going to have time, and expect that you're going to have a little bit of patience with not just your team, but your whole company, in order to get the answers that you're looking for. And this famous cycle, which I'm sure we've all seen, and it's in terms of building products, you build, measure, and learn. But I think there's a mini loop of this going on as well in terms of getting data you need. You might build it, you might extract your data and then say, actually, stuff is missing, or this isn't doing what I think it's doing, learn and go back and do it again. And this is its own mini cycle, before you could get down to the bigger product, build, measure, learn. I did want to say one thing that I thought of from a recent conversation I had with our data scientist, and he was telling me about running experiments, and I'm sure you guys have heard of A/B testing and regression, multivariate regression, so on and so forth. And he said something really interesting. He said he had a meeting early on in the company, where he was doing some testing on our customer base, and he got into a room with people, and he was telling him what his findings were, and he's like, I can't remember what we were looking at, but I remember we spent the better part of that meeting explaining the validity of the test. And he's like, I wish we had just kept it simple, because ultimately, even how you communicate data, it's a communication tool. So he's like, just avoid anything where you have to really explain the work behind it. Keeping it simple is going to be much easier to communicate with people what you're trying to change or what you've just learned. And I thought that was really important, because I think we could easily get distracted with tests we could run. Yeah.
I would put the flip on that.
Yeah.
It's important to understand what your outcome is of what you're trying to measure. Sometimes the testing and how intricate it is the most important thing, especially if you're doing machine learning or running business rules or applying a methodology of transforming and reshaping the data.
Yeah.
Sometimes the test does need to be complex.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I hope in those cases, the people and the company, and particularly the decision makers around that, are also maybe more in the know about the type of tests that you need to run. But yeah, absolutely. I'm by no means suggesting dumbing it down, just about anything in product. It depends, right? Before I go into the recap, any questions? Yeah.
There was a slide that you just missed. And you said you're going to go back to it just before this one? Yeah.
Yeah. So if you've heard of Simon Sinek's book, Start with the Why, to really understand, what it is that you're building. I'm sure, are most of you familiar with this? Yeah, it's really popular nowadays in product. But I think there's an element to this in terms of data as well, and particularly the data that you're assigned to collect and the things you want to measure. Like before you do tracking, if you can, or any new tracking, start with the why and think about like, what does your customer need and what are the product questions that you're trying to answer? Like, what are the answers that your customer is looking out for? Like, start there and then figure out what data you need for that, and then build that data, assuming that's what you're going into. And that was the bit where, when you do that, expect that process might take a little bit of time.
I think sometimes if you start at the end of that process,
Yeah.
it can be equally informative of the why.
Yeah, have you found that?
The outcome first and what you think you're trying to achieve, it will sometimes really help you define the why.
And do you mean, like, when I hear that, I'm thinking of something like, we might start with like a prototype and take it to our users, and that might illuminate other things. Do you mean it in a slightly different example?
Yeah, that one still sort of works. I think just sometimes if you think of an end game or an output,
Yeah.
and test that hypothesis of that what you think is right.
Yeah.
Because sometimes it will then reshape why you thought it was right and then why it's become wrong or why it needs to evolve or change. I just think it's sometimes worth doing that process.
The other way.
Directions.
That is so cool. Like that I feel like could be like a talk in itself, because I think that's a really interesting way to flip it on its head and learn something new. The other bit I was thinking with that when you were saying, flip it on its head, is one thing I didn't get into, particularly when we talk about running tests, is, I don't know, depending on your role and what you're doing, like at our company, like it's very difficult to run tests because it's very difficult to like single out one or two variables and we're keeping everything else constant. The other parts of the product, even right down to our customers, are usually in flux. So running like traditional experiments doesn't necessarily lend itself to like all parts of the customer experience. But I definitely don't want to undermine the importance of running experiments if you have the opportunity to do so. So just coming back to recap some of the things that we've gone over. I just want to say understanding your data model is understanding your product. And this goes all the way from understanding like the primary attributes, the things that are required for your product, as well as some of maybe like the secondary attributes like tracking and behavior and things like that. Be clear about what your product is trying to achieve, like start with the why. That's going to help you in figuring out the data you need. And be clear about the questions you're trying to answer in order to achieve your goal. This is much easier when your company has alignment on those questions as well. Like you guys have probably experienced that, but it's very well and good that you might have a question about your customers, but because sometimes answering those questions with data takes time, it's best to just try and have as many people on board or bought into answering those questions and the value of those answers in order to have the time to do that. And then structure your data around answering those questions. Hopefully this explains itself. Don't collect data you don't need. And talk to your customers.
So this to me sounds really good if you're starting from scratch.
Yeah.
You're going to have a new data model, you're starting up and you do your best efforts and endeavours to make that data model as correct and accurate as possible.
Yeah.
But in 2 months' time, that data model is out of date, or you're then trying to align it with another data model so you can start to get more rich insights.
Yeah.
Where would you go with consistency where actually you might not even be the controller of the data, you're just trying to consume it? Yeah,
I think that's like a bigger question. I was debating like even putting this up there. I don't know if it delves too much into like data architecture and like where, who's mastering the data versus like where are you trying to do things like marrying up certain patterns or trying to like extract different insights when maybe some of that lives in a completely separate systems. I think honestly that could probably be its like own separate talk, because like everything, it depends, and the more complex it is and the more like systems or third parties, like whatever, whether it's internal or external, like obviously that magnifies the complexity and the considerations you have. Is that what you're doing?
I don't know, I think that's probably what I was expecting to be touched on when the title was about consistency of data.
Yeah.
This to me is a fresh start. These are the things to think about before you build a database or build a data model. So
Yeah, no, I completely get it. So my approach was, these are some of the things that I think were kind of hard-won truths for me. And when I was getting into product and when I was first learning about it, I'd often go to Medium or, any other product resource. And I was always out for like tactics because I wanted stuff that I could just use immediately. And sometimes I read articles that to me felt like fluffy is the best way I could describe it. And even one like sacrilege, burst in flames, like Ben Horowitz's book, The Hard Thing About Hard Things, right? Like, it's like popular, people are like, oh, it's amazing. And it is, but it's written about someone who has so much deep experience that there's probably things in there that we don't even realize are being said. And that's how I felt about some of like the fluffy articles. I'm like, that's great, but I can't really use it. And then the longer I've been in product, the more I go back and read some of like the fluffy articles. I'm like, actually the tactics are really easy. The stuff that's hard is like bringing your company on board and saying, we have all this data, we have all these reports, but they're not the things that we should be answering and they're not where we should be focusing. And I appreciate, depending on your organization, that may be a problem you don't have. And that's awesome, but I did want to highlight it here, and maybe I didn't spend enough time on that part, that I think the bigger hurdle you have is actually bringing people on board to answer the why of your product and your goals. And then the data consistency that comes out of that, either through your primary attributes or your secondary attributes and how you treat that data, that's hard. Like you could probably do the code switches, but bringing people on board for that mission is, yeah, it's a job. Yeah.
So a couple questions. How do you create a data set that you can communicate to the rest of the organization?
Yeah.
And secondly, how does product data tie into other departments' data, such as sort of marketing and other departments?
So when you say create a data set that could plug into the rest of the organization, you mean?
So if I were to give an overview of how the product is performing,
yeah.
What sort of data do I look at, and how do I segment data that's useful for the product team internally and gives an overview of the health of the product to the external company?
Yeah, I mean, I would say even something like, when you say the health of your product, I'm guessing you within your role, your company have some bounded parameters to define health.
Yeah, so that's what ties into the second part of my question.
Yeah.
Do you look at product data and the health of the product in isolation, or do you tie in data models from other parts of the company into a broader picture?
Well, at our particular company, they're all one and the same, like we're all drawing from the same data, so we don't have the challenge of, in my particular role, we don't have the challenge of somebody else has something slightly different.
Yeah.
And to say something like the health or maybe even success, again, the hard part is within your product team, within your company, defining what that success criteria is, yeah. And then ensuring that you're measuring the product things that feed into that. So, for us, when we were talking about the time people spend maybe like doing a compliance review, after talking to our customers, we're like, it doesn't make sense that this is an internal metric because it's not really important to our customers. And it drove a conversation around what metric does matter. Is it how long they're waiting on us to finish something, which I think it is, because that's a very important part of their satisfaction with our company. But those are the kind of things like the value you bring to your customers and how you measure that and how you agree to measure that within your company are the things where I'd align for feeding into reporting.
Essentially, I'm just sort of thinking is within the product, you've got levers which you can control and levers which you can't control.
Yeah.
So how do you tie in levers that you can't control?
Yeah.
And do you even bother looking at that data?
So I do, because I care about what our customers are going through, and I think that also drives interesting conversations in our company. And I think depending on your product, like it depends on, do you measure that? Do you not? Like, I want to know what's in our customer's head. I want to know when they go live, whether we use that or not. We can, but there might be other things going on, like they're buying a dog or something, it's nothing to do with us and our company. So yeah, I mean, it's a very satisfying, it depends. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
What is your personal experience to sustain this alignment in the company?
Yeah.
What did you do, like proper, at regular meetings, asking so many questions, bombing people?
This could be a talk on its own. I mean, to be blunt, it's repeating yourself a lot in slightly different ways to slightly different audiences, and then doing it again and forwards and backwards. And it's the best word I could think of for that is it's kind of like an internal campaign, because that's what it becomes, and people don't really change on the first conversation, and particularly not if it's areas that they're very invested in or areas that they've worked in for a long time, or have lots of assumptions about, myself included. It's just a much harder hurdle to overcome. But really, it's bringing people aside, maybe bringing people on that you think are going to be champions of that and that kind of thinking, and talking to some of them early on, getting their feedback, and spreading the word. It's not easy. This is probably much harder than a code switch to turn on, Google Analytics. Like, actually working with the people in your company on like getting that kind of alignment is, it's hard. It's the fluffy stuff, in my opinion, the hard, fluffy stuff. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah?
I read once that when you're interviewing, 5 is enough. 35 is way, way, way too many people. In the first 5, you're like 80% of the problem and stuff. So, in your experience, is that true?
The thinking that went behind that, and there's like a formula behind it as well, is that when you test with 5 people, you're going to get, I think, something that was referred to as the big rocks, and these are like the biggest issues in your product. And beyond that, those big issues like have been represented, but you may see like smaller pieces of like problems or errors. I found that to be true, as in with a data set of 5 people, we found the really big issues, and anything beyond that has actually just been smaller stuff. So yeah, we've absolutely found that and worked to that within our sets.
So the hard thing is identifying those 5 people?
Yeah, so here's what we've done. Maybe it depends on what part of the product, but what we tend to do is try and split it to people who've used our product, like who are customers, and people who've never used our product, just to try and maybe eliminate some of the expectations for the people who are our customers. So yeah, then it's kind of 10 people, but I think it's still valid. I was just curious, any thoughts on that from anybody who's done user testing or thought about sample size? Have you?
Do you use external agencies?
We have before. Yeah, so we've done it, but we're not opposed to it. Inevitably, we end up doing our own because it's quicker to just wind it up and, yeah.
Do you often find you miss sort of edge cases? Or how do you have an internal tester who covers all possible scenarios for any feature?
When you say edge cases, do you mean for errors or edge cases in terms of like stuff people want? Stuff people are like feeding back on?
More sort of about bugs, if you're releasing a new feature and, one scenario might affect 0.01% of people.
Yeah.
How do you do that internally without taking a huge amount of resource to take every possible scenario into account?
Honestly, we factor it into our release. So we'll, if it's like 0 point something, depending on like that number, I'll be like, no, we're rolling out with it anyway. And then these are slotted in a little bit later, just given the people that it affects. Yeah. Do you find yourself running into that?
Well, we use an external agency, so
it's how good. Good hands. Yeah. Yeah. Anything else? I'm curious, how many of you are like directly accessing your company data and directly dealing with data, be it you're in, dashboards or you're in SQL? Yeah. Awesome. Well, I'm sorry if some of this was like skimming the surface on some of the stuff, but yeah, I still think it's important to go through. Were you going to say something?
I was just going to say, how much access should you give to sort of databases like SQL or something, production databases within the company? Because if the idea is to achieve a common understanding of data within the product, how do you communicate that without giving access, and what tools do you use?
We have a few different tools because in our company, different teams go for slightly different variations of the data.
Is it all based on the sort of live production database, or you copy it? Or?
The answer is yes, but depending on like the reporting platform, there might be like a latency, and it might not be a comprehensive snapshot of the live database. Yeah. But you know, for example, something like investments and like the amount reached on a pitch, like some of that is going to be pretty up to date across all the things, but something like our users' data, that's not going to be available to everyone, everywhere, in every report. Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Thank you so much.